Good morning, folks. We have been working on informal logical fallacies during the last couple of class sessions. We addressed what we call the fallacies of presumption in our earlier lectures. Today, I'm going to introduce the next fallacy set. And hopefully you'll read about those in your text. This next set of fallacies all falls under a broader heading that are sometimes called fallacies of relevance. Now, just to reiterate, if something is relevant, we mean something like this. If this particular bit of information is true, and it's what we call relevant, it relates to the conclusion that we're trying to draw. In other words, it has something to do with whether or not we should accept the conclusion or not. That is sort of a watered down way of talking about what relevancy is. Now, the fallacies of relevance will indicate that there are times when some bit of information may look relevant to drawing a conclusion, when in reality, the information is not relevant to drawing the conclusion. I am going to illustrate by example by talking about the first case of fallacies of relevance. And I suspect some of you have already heard this concept before. As a matter of fact, I know several of you have heard this concept before. The argument ad hominem. This is the first one on this fallacy list. Now, like much of the language centered around logic, this comes straight out of what language? Latin. Yeah, it's a Latin phrase. Ad hominem literally means at the person, or at the man is how they used to explain it. Ad hominem. Now, what happens when we commit the ad hominem is something like this. Person will tell us this, that we are right to reject so-and-so's argument. And guess what the reason that the person gives is? So-and-so is an awful person of some sort. Now notice I just gave you here a template. I didn't give you the example of what kind of an awful person. Now, you might, I'll go for an easy example, and I've heard people say this one before. Consider any of the arguments made by Sigmund Freud. No way! Why would I accept any arguments made by a wrong-headed atheist like him? Now notice what that does. It suggests that we ought to reject all of Sigmund Freud's ideas out of hand on the grounds that he's an atheist. By the way, his being an atheist is irrelevant to whether or not he can make reasonable arguments or not. Politically speaking, I have relatives who reject any arguments made by Democrats on the grounds that they were made by Democrats. Oh, I have some friends who have dismissed arguments out of hand on the grounds that they were made by Republicans. Now, you'll notice that the failure of the ad hominem is arguments are either well done on their own merits, or they are fallacious on their own merits. In other words, in order to evaluate an argument, you actually have to do what? You actually have to examine the argument. When you use the ad hominem, you basically ignore the argument altogether and reject it on the grounds of who made it. It is irrelevant who made the argument. Arguments are either cogent or fallacious on their own merits. Now, one of the reasons why the ad hominem may not seem like a fallacy is because of some bad psychological thinking that's going on. Many people fail to recognize that an argument is not inextricably linked to the arguer. The fact is, the argument can be separated from the arguer. Who made it is not relevant to whether it is credible or not. However, psychologically, people oftentimes link the two, and they think, well, that can't be a good argument because so-and-so is a liar. Well, guess what? So-and-so might be a liar, but testimony isn't the same thing as an argument. Arguments rise and fall on their own merits. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is technically a form of, I guess, flawed inductive reasoning.
Well, there is something like that going on because I think people induce falsely that there is, in fact, a definite link between arguer and argument. But that link is, of course, not real. The argument ought to be assessed on its own merits. Now, the typical version of the ad hominem is sometimes called ad hominem abusive. We call it ad hominem abusive because typically what the person will do is bash the person who made the argument rather than actually address the argument itself. And being abusive oftentimes means character attacks, things of this nature. And by the way, folks, character does matter if a person is giving testimony. But testimony is not the same thing as an argument. This is why character does matter in like a court trial or something, because we're talking about evidence and facts. Evidence and facts are not the same thing as arguments. Evidence and facts are sometimes parts of arguments, but they are not the arguments itself. Arguments need to be addressed on their own merit. Now, in upcoming lectures, we will discuss more about this fallacy as well as other fallacies of relevance.